Babs had died, and her partner Bobby was allowed in to see her. He touched her gently, tried to speak to her, and in his disbelief, he tried to revive her just in case his senses were deceiving him, just in case it was possible. He tried to get her to eat, thinking that maybe the smell of her favorite food would change the unchangeable. And when all had failed, Bobby fell silent and then began to make guttural sounds that grew and grew until he was wailing and banging on the walls. Harper and Cole. They survived a traumatic and abusive environment together, and once saved, they were able to continue living together in safety. Cole had terrible injuries to his legs, and Harper was blind in one eye. Unsurprisingly, they were deeply distrustful and only comfortable with each other. Eventually, Cole succumbed to his injuries, and he died. And when Harper was allowed to see Cole, he laid his head on Cole and stayed there for several hours. And over the next few months, Harper went every day to their favorite spot next to a small pond, and there he would sit. Efforts to introduce him to another potential friend didn't take, which was especially sad because Harper was now even more nervous around people without Cole. Everyone recognized Harper's depression. 2 months later, Harper died as well. David has had a tumultuous time in his time of leadership, and one of his sons, Absalom, was greatly loved by both David and the people. He was handsome and charming, and he eventually began to speak out against the ways that he felt the king was ignoring the people's pleas for justice. He eventually turned on his own father, thinking he could rule more justly, and started a rebellion. And David then took up arms against his son's forces, yet all the while begging that his army not harm the rebellious Absalom. And then Absalom, while riding his mule in the forest during battle, got himself stuck in a tree and couldn't get unstuck. And despite David's orders otherwise, Joab, one of the generals, killed Absalom. When David learned of this fact, he was deeply moved, went to a position above the city gate, and he wept. And he proclaimed, "Oh, my son, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." Where do you see yourself in these stories? Who do you relate to? What have you done? What have you witnessed others doing? Do you cry out, wishing to bargain your life for the one that was lost, like David did? Do you burst into grief, bang the walls, and let loose screams like Bobby? Do you quietly search for any last remnants of your love and feel as if life was no longer living, like Harper? How do you mourn? How do you grieve? How do you weep? There is no right way to grieve. There is no right way to grieve. Let us make sure that is heard. There is no right way to grieve. But there certainly are ways that are harmful. As is in life, it is easy to name the things that are harmful more so than what is right. It is harmful to hurt others or yourself as a response to your grief. It is harmful to try and rewrite history so that you can avoid the feelings altogether. There are reactions to the feelings of loss that are certainly harmful, but there are no right ways to grieve. We see that in our three stories. We feel that in our lives. Our story of David comes from our continued exploration of the books of Samuel and the constantly dramatic saga of David. But the first two stories come from a book by Barbara J. King called How Animals Grieve. Babs and Bobby are silverback gorillas, and Cole and Harper are moulard ducks. King completes the story about ducks, Cole and Harper, by saying, "When there is grief, there was love." We grieve because we love. If we didn't care, we wouldn't weep. If we didn't love, we wouldn't hurt. It is the very fact of our love that later results in great loss. My wife right now is away at a writing retreat, and when our daughter, who is wonderfully sitting here today, feels sad and overwhelmed by missing her mommy, we talk about how missing her is just a reminder about how much we love her. Right? Yeah. This helps root the sadness back into the depths of love. The love and the loss are part of the same hand. Philosopher and theologian Nicholas Wolterstorff wrote a book called Lament for a Son after his child died at age 25 in an accident. And he writes, "We all suffer. For we all prize and love, and in this present existence of ours, prizing and loving yield suffering. Love in our world is suffering love. Some do not suffer much, though, for they do not love much. Suffering is for the loving. This, said Jesus, is the command of the Holy One. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. In commanding us to love, God invites us to suffer." Bobby, Harper, and David are all suffering due to their losses of those they cared for and loved. The gorilla and the duck, though, were innocent in their loss. They bore no responsibility to their loved one's death. David, though, carries great responsibility. He allowed his side of the conflict with his son to reach the point of breakage. And then he chose to actively fight him. He chose war. And he chose to stay home while the war was then being fought by other people. And as much as he might have desired for Absalom to remain untouched, one cannot choose both war and safety at the same time. And David, despite his responsibilities in all this, and maybe even because of them, weeps hard because he loved his son. What I want to know is, my question at this moment is, how did this grief, how did this loss change him? His weeping did not absolve his guilt. He was not actually able to trade his life for his son's as he tearfully begged. He had to live with this loss for the rest of his life. Our grief never goes away, but it does transform over time, and it can change us. Wolterstorff again writes, "Grief is existential testimony to the worth of the one loved. That worth abides, so I own my grief. I do not try to put it behind me, to get over it, to forget it. Every lament is a love song." I want to know what happened to this grief of David. Did it make him more compassionate, as losses want to do? Or did it eat him from the inside, as is always possible? Or a bit of both? And then I wonder, how will our losses transform and change us? How will we weep together at the losses that we have and that we will bear? Not as individuals, but as a collective, as a community, as a society. There is much we seem to love together, which inevitably means there will be much to grieve. How will we weep together when the world as we know it can no longer adapt to the ways that we use or abuse it? How will we weep when the disparities that we have somehow learned to tolerate continue to cause great and irreversible harm? How will we weep when the weight of oppression and marginalization continues to get heavier and heavier? How will we weep when there are no more silverback gorillas to mourn each other? How will we weep as we continue to let the power-minded overtake the justice seekers? How will we weep when many of these things that we love are lost, especially when we all bear at least some responsibility in both the love and the loss? How shall we weep? Now, I no longer, after the last few weeks especially, know how much of an example David should be for us. But it might be helpful to know what he did after he wept. In the next chapter, he is described as going out into the community. Then the king got up and took his seat in the gate, and the people gathered around him, and they celebrated their success, and they mourned their losses together. They did not weep alone. I don't know how we shall weep, but I do hope that we don't avoid the laments. And I do hope that we don't do it alone, that we don't do it in isolation. And the pointing finger of this sermon and seemingly so many others is coming back to being in community together. Not that we always like it, not that we always agree with each other, not that it's easy or comfortable. Loving with and among each other and grieving with and among each other is the stuff of God. It is life, and it is life-giving. It can be where we go after we have raged against the unfairness of the losses that we bear. Here is where we can go to practice our transformations and let us sing the lamentations of our love songs. May we be transformed by our weeping. And may we make changes based on our grieving. As Wolterstorff says, I shall look at the world through tears. Perhaps I shall see things that dry-eyed I could not see. Perhaps I shall see things that dry-eyed I could not see. Just as there is so much to love and celebrate, there is so much to weep for. May we see anew from our tear-filled eyes and perceive what was before unperceivable. May we build a new understanding and a new vision through our tears, and may we do it together. Amen.